Be careful what you say about Saudi Arabia. The kingdom cuts ties with Canada after criticism from Ottawa. Is Justin Trudeau interfering in Saudi affairs, or is the Crown Prince in Riyadh manufacturing a crisis? I'm Adnan Nawaz. Today's newsmaker is the breakdown in Saudi-Canadian relations. A diplomatic war started by a tweet. Last week, the Canadian Foreign Ministry used Twitter to condemn Saudi Arabia's arrest of women's rights activists. It also called for the release of one of them, Samar Badawi, whose in-laws are Canadian citizens. The tweet sparked a complete breakdown of relations. Riyadh cut diplomatic ties, froze trade deals. It's suspending flights. It's going to prevent Saudi citizens from getting medical treatment or studying in Canada. Riyadh wants an apology. But really, is Saudi Arabia telling the rest of the world, criticize us and suffer the consequences? Haider Abbasi reports.
Saudi Arabia wants Canada to pay a price. In just a few days, ties between the countries have all but evaporated. Saudi Arabia has expelled Canada's ambassador, frozen trade, plans to suspend flights, and is withdrawing around 15,000 students from Canada. But what caused this fierce reaction? It was a single tweet. Last week, Canada's Foreign Ministry tweeted it was concerned about the arrest of human rights activists in Saudi Arabia, and that was enough to provoke Riyadh.
We do not accept to be told what to do, and we do not accept for a country to interfere in our internal affairs, just as we do not interfere in any country's internal affairs. We think that what Canada did is unacceptable.
Among the activists jailed are Samar Badawi, the sister of imprisoned blogger Raif Badawi. He was sentenced to 10 years and 1,000 lashes in 2014 for insulting Islam. His wife and children have since become Canadian citizens. Samar Badawi campaigns for women's rights and won the International Women of Courage Award in 2012. The United Nations says at least 15 Saudi rights activists have been arrested since May 15th. Despite the backlash from Saudi Arabia, Canada is not backing down.
We continue to engage diplomatically and politically with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. We have respect for their importance in the world and recognize that they have made progress on a number of important issues, but we will at the same time continue to speak clearly and firmly on issues of human rights at home and abroad, wherever we see the need.
Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been portrayed as the great reformer of his country. He's lifted a decades-old ban on women driving, allowed cinemas to open in the kingdom for the first time, and says he's eager to crack down on corruption. The dispute with Canada might put the Crown Prince's image at risk. It could also do the same with business deals between the two countries. In 2014, Canada agreed to sell Saudi Arabia armoured vehicles in an agreement worth $15 billion. If that deal's scrapped, thousands of jobs in Canada will be lost. What's behind Saudi Arabia's aggressive reaction? And what can Canada do to improve ties? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
And to discuss this, we're joined from Ottawa by Ferry de Kerkhove. He's a former Canadian ambassador to Egypt and has decades of experience in defence and foreign policy. In Waterloo, near Toronto, Besma Momeni. She is a professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and a senior fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation. In London for us is Hesham Al-Ghanam. He is an associate fellow at the King Faisal Centre for Research and Islamic Studies. Thank you to all three of you. I have to start with you, Hisham. Is this not a total overreaction to a tweet that didn't actually demand anything, just made a suggestion?
I don't think it's just a tweet. The problem started with this current Liberal government in Canada. I do think it's much deeper than a tweet. The dispute is, for sure, definitely the tweet had I mean, it ended the Saudi tolerance towards the current Canadian government, but it wasn't only about tweet. It's about using not using the proper means to conduct foreign policy and to speak with a country that you should have a mutual, and you're currently having a mutual beneficial relationship with. This is what upset the Saudis. They saw this as an insult, and they saw this as a PR to deflect internal and domestic criticism towards the current government in Canada because of the light armored vehicles deal that would probably be scrapped now and cancelled if things that continue to be escalated.
Ferry, what do you make of the reaction from Riyadh? I mean, these are a raft of measures which would usually be imposed when something you would think far more serious happens in bilateral relations.
Well, I have to say that I find the reaction of the Saudi rather appalling. I do not deny the fact that Mrs. Freeland's tweet was certainly an intrusion, but very legitimate in the name of human rights. But it was a request, some speed up in the process, and the sooner the liberation of Mr. Badawi, the better. We've been at it for quite a while. The fact that started that was, of course, the decision to have even the sister of Mr. Badawi arrested. And so the reaction of Canada as a defender of human rights and democracy did that tweet. A lot of people have been bemoaning the tweet. In fact, whether it would have been a tweet or an answer to a journalist or whatever, that is not the issue. The issue is the human rights treatment of people in Saudi Arabia. But of course, the reaction of the Saudi had to be expected. The Crown Prince doesn't broach any criticism. He wants to do things on his own, on his rhythm, and without being harassed by outsiders. And of course, choosing Canada as opposed to a country with whom Saudi Arabia has extensive relation is an easy way, because after all, you've got a trading relationship of about $4 billion. And so, yes, the reaction is really exaggerated compared to the nature of the tweet itself. Kicking out an ambassador in 24 hours is very harsh. Kicking out 7,000 medical students from Canada and sending them, the poor kids, sending all over the world to renew their studies elsewhere, disrupting families. Of course, it's very harsh. All of these measures are exaggerated, but they don't surprise me given the nature of the sensitivity of the Crown Prince from any criticism from abroad.
Besma, you've been nodding your head throughout Ferry's answer there. Over to you.
Look, the reality is I think there is only one real attempt of deflection here, and that's what's happening in Saudi Arabia. To your first guest, Hisham, look, the reality is the LAV deal has been said and done, critiqued, and frankly, all of the hoopla over that was over about a year ago. So there's no real attempt to deflect here in terms of the LAV deal. That said, what is being deflected is the criticism of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of his approach to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And I think that's where the deflection attempt is. You know, the past week, Arab media, including internal, I think very quiet, but internal discussion inside the kingdom has been that, frankly, this deal is not favorable, particularly to the Palestinians, and that Jared Kushner's very close relationship with Mohammed bin Salman has maybe perhaps compromised Mohammed bin Salman's loyalty to the Palestinian cause. That has been reverberating inside the Arab media for several weeks, and it's not a coincidence that his father, the King Salman, basically reined in his son and told him enough is enough, and put out a very bold statement that frankly is a rebuke of his son, that basically we stand firm with the Palestinians' long desires. And so I think this is the real deflection. It's not about Canada. It's never been about Canada. It's about Saudi Arabia. And as Ferry said, because our bilateral economic relationship is relatively so low, it's frankly easy to sacrifice Canada. They're not going to do this with the UK. They're not going to do this with the United States. And you can find plenty of statements. The United States report of human rights, and just released in June of this year, is a long laundry list of accusations against the Saudis for their human rights violations. So there's nothing new in terms of what Canada said. But we are a sacrificial lamb because it's sent out the message to the world that Mohammed bin Salman does not take criticism, and if you do, lucrative contracts and business deals will be cut. And hence we see the international community today, starting with the UK and even the United States, which frankly has upset many, many Canadians, absolutely silent. They are deafeningly silent on the issue of supporting Canada in this. And so Mohammed bin Salman did win. He won in terms of signaling to the world that you criticize Saudi Arabia, you will be punished.
So many issues there, Hisham, for you to pick up on, because these accusations about what's going on in Saudi Arabia are not new. Human Rights Watch has said for the past few months there's an unrelenting crackdown on the women's rights movement. King Salman, as Besma has mentioned, has said in public that Saudi Arabia does not support the American position of recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. MBS, the Crown Prince, particularly silent about that. So is this deflection from Saudi Arabia rather than what you say, deflection in Canada?
I'm not going to refute the conspiracy theory part.
There's no conspiracy theories. They're just accusations that are going around.
Please. He did not interrupt. Let me speak, please. The official position, Saudi position towards the Palestinian-Israeli issue did not change in the last 2 years. So I'm not going into this, refuting this conspiracy theories that Basma just said. And the part that, yes, many numerous other Western countries produce these human rights reports. And the Saudis know that they are used, as the Saudis are a perfect target for the left and the West for domestic political gains. This is totally understandable by the Saudis. And the Saudis also understand there are two radically different value systems between Canada and Saudi. And the Canadians do not have to agree with the Saudis on that. The problem that remains is that there were other channels that the Canadians could have conducted their message, communicated what they wanted to do, other than Twitter and trying to insult the Saudis, like the way that it happened. I mean, this is the main issue. It's not about having criticism towards human rights. Many other countries in the West do that, and many other countries in the West are less important to Canada than the Saudis. They could have done it with them, but it's not about this. It's about insulting the Saudis and the way that it happened. It's about conducting foreign policy on social media. It's about the Canadian embassy in Riyadh ordering and commanding the Saudis to release someone that is under investigation now. I mean, this is not acceptable by any means.
Okay, listen, the word that was used in the tweet was urge. It was not demand. It was not a demand, it seems.
Immediately
release. The word was urge.
Release.
Ferry, the issue
here...
Yes,
I know, immediately release.
No, okay, but urge. Ferry, Hisham seems to be basically repeating the line that is coming out of Riyadh. So how much of a concern is it for the rest of the world?
No, I'm not repeating the line.
No, but no,
Riyadh is saying that. Riyadh is saying it's about the tweet.
Yeah,
there is a context to that.
Absolutely, yes.
The narrative that you're producing is not correct. Well, the issues with this current Canadian government is long before the tweet. It's not only about the tweet.
No, absolutely. I totally understand that. That's not a problem. Okay. But we're talking about the reaction that has come after the tweet. Okay, we understand that you say that it's more about just what was in those characters on social media. But Ferry, the issue is here, how is this changing political and diplomatic dialogue if a country can say something as simple as Canada did and then produce this reaction from a country like Saudi Arabia? Does it mean that now political dialogue is different, that people have to be more circumspect in what they say, that they shouldn't stand up for their rights because this kind of reaction could come and be directed towards any other country?
Well, I'll start by being very happy that the values between Canada and those of the Saudi are different, because I would hate to have the same values if it's that the kind of treatment that you're meting out to people who are trying to defend their own country and their own rights. But I would say that I tend to agree that the dialogue has changed, and this is why we in the West, instead of shutting up, we actually have to speak out and create a kind of an alliance of democracies and defenders of human rights, because it is true that it's not just in Saudi Arabia. We see our neighbor to the south, which is also becoming extraordinarily indifferent to certain human rights, and I won't go to the list. You have illiberal democracies in Eastern Europe. You've got a rise of populism. So I think that indeed democracy and human rights are in danger. All the more reason not to diminish the tone of the dialogue, the tone of the request, the tone tone of urging or demanding or whatever utterance that you would like to quote. My bottom line is that, no, there's a constant need to do more and better in terms of defending human rights. Institutions like Amnesty International and others should be revered rather than condemned. I think it's a global issue, and yes, the dialogue has changed, but traditional diplomacy won't really work. We have to have both quiet diplomacy and also clearly express the fundamental values that motivate us. Otherwise, we're going to lose out our countries to an entirely different political and economic spectrum. I agree that the 2008 crisis, economic crisis in the West, have brought a lot of countries in Asia and elsewhere to question the value of the model that we have established starting in 1945 and onwards. And also that has also created a kind of a love affair with authoritarian, autocratic government, hence the need, quite to the contrary, to create an alliance of liberal, economically open, democratic, and human rights abiding countries to try and run counter, to buck the trend.
Ferry, I'd like to pick up on that point. And just finally, Besma, to you, the alliance that Ferry is talking about that he would like to see, there's been complete silence, I believe, from the United States on this issue. There's been relative silence from the United Kingdom. It's basically issued a bland statement saying both sides should show restraint. Are you surprised at the lack of support for Canada in this particular dispute?
Well, it's unprecedented. Frankly, this is something that Canada is just not accustomed to. You know, we tend to play nice, but we are very supportive of the concept of multilateralism. NATO, obviously NAFTA, you know, all of these alliances is kind of the Canadian foreign policy modus operandi. We love to be a part of groups and like-minded groups, and we assume that like-minded groups, our NATO allies and others, would at least utter some words of support. And we've seen a deafening silence, which again points to the point that I was raised earlier, which is that Mohammed bin Salman has won in sending out the chill to the international community not to criticize the Saudis. Now, of course, as Ferry pointed out, you know, Donald Trump is a loose cannon, and there is no love lost between Donald Trump and Justin Trudeau, our Prime Minister. You know, Donald Trump has mocked our Prime Minister on Twitter. He said very terrible things about him, and I think it points to the reality that there is a fascination among these illiberal democracies with strong men. There is, unfortunately, not an appreciation for the kind of progressive values that someone like Justin Trudeau espouses. And so we have two different role models in the world today.
Sure. Listen, we have to leave it there. I'm sorry, we have run out of time, but to all three
Can I say something?
Thank you very much. I'm afraid, Hisham, we really haven't got time for it. We have run out, and we have to move on to the next item. But thank you for joining us on the Newsmakers, all three of you. Still ahead on the Newsmakers, the Saudi-led coalition is accused of recruiting members of Al-Qaeda to help its war efforts in Yemen. And separated at sea, what can be done to reunite refugee families who have been rescued but end up on opposite shores of the Mediterranean? In Yemen, the latest airstrike by the Saudi-led coalition has killed dozens of civilians. The alliance says it was targeting a missile launcher in a province controlled by Houthi rebels, but the strike hit a school bus. Many of the dead are children. Well, it's emerged this week that this same Saudi coalition has allegedly recruited Al-Qaeda fighters in its battle against the Houthis. Wars, of course, are complicated affairs. In an effort to win any conflict, loyalties can be laid aside. Years of antagonism can be ignored. Enemies can become allies. But an investigation by the Associated Press has found evidence of a very unlikely alliance. It alleges Riyadh's secret deals with Al-Qaeda are known to Washington, and that the US military has even held off on drone strikes to allow Al-Qaeda members to leave areas that the coalition then claims to have liberated from the terror group. This is the same Al-Qaeda that the Americans and the Saudis are officially fighting across the Middle East, and which attacked the United States 17 years ago on 9/11. Joining me now from Richmond, Virginia, is Sheila Carapico, a professor of political science at the University of Richmond and the author of Civil Society in Yemen. And in Yemen's capital, Sana'a, for us is Hussein al-Bukaiti, a Yemeni journalist. Thank you very much both for your time. Now, I should preface our discussion by saying that we did at TRT World speak to a number of people who would represent the Saudi position. They all refused to talk to us. Sheila, the Associated Press has conducted interviews in Yemen with militia members, with tribal mediators, with Yemeni security officials. Is there any reason to doubt this story?
I mean, it didn't come as a surprise to most of us who've been watching this war closely. Because, for instance, you know, there were accounts of victories over al-Qaeda, but there had never been accounts of actual fighting with al-Qaeda. Clear that both al-Qaeda and the Saudi-led coalition are fighting against the Houthis. The Houthis fight against al-Qaeda. So, I mean, it's logical. What the Associated Press did was to give more empirical evidence for something that was quite sort of intuitively obvious.
Hussein, it appears quite clear that the United States and Saudi Arabia consider Iranian expansionism to be much more of a danger than the Houthi rebels themselves and the war in Yemen. Does that provide any sort of logic for making deals with such a terror group as al-Qaeda?
No, it doesn't make any logic to make deals with criminal to fight someone who maybe you have an issue with, like with Iran. The Saudi-led coalition has used the excuse of Iran present in Yemen to fight and to attack Yemen. Meanwhile, we see that, as example, United Arab Emirates claims that Iran occupy 3 islands in the Persian Gulf, but still they haven't fired a single shot in there. What's happening in Yemen is actually that the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia are doing the same strategy that the United States has done in Afghanistan. When they recruited extremist militia, they invented actually, they are the one who made al-Qaeda into Afghanistan to fight the Russian and then to fight other group who were against the United States in Afghanistan. And now the same tactic is done by the United Arab Emirates. They do it in 2 stages. In some areas like in the coast of Taiz, in Mocha, in Bab al-Mandab and in Hudaydah, west coast, they are recruiting al-Qaeda to fight in those areas side by side with the Saudi-backed coalition. But in other areas like in Abyan, in Mukalla, and in other cities, the United Arab Emirates just struck deals and paying al-Qaeda money just to keep them quiet for a while, and they claim victory at that time. I remember some website in United Arab Emirates claim when they entered Mukalla that they have killed 800 al-Qaeda fighter. I mean, this number of al-Qaeda fighter to be killed in 2 or 3 hours has not happened in any area, I believe, on the planet. But to see that they recruited al-Qaeda, struck deal with al-Qaeda, and then they fight the Muslim Brotherhood, who are fighting side by side with the United Arab Emirates from the beginning. Then most of the prisoners in United Arab Emirates secret prison are from the Muslim Brotherhood, who have helped Saudi coalition to enter Aden. But al-Qaeda is actually running free in South Yemen.
Sheila, Hussein seems to suggest the United States actually has a strategy in Yemen. Some people think that it doesn't.
The United States doesn't have a specific Yemen policy, but rather a policy which is to back Saudi Arabia in all of its ambitions in the region, which have tended to center on kind of being the hegemonic power in the Arabian Peninsula. Yemen is the most populous country in the Arabian Peninsula, and the Saudis have had, decades of attempting to control outcomes inside of Yemen. So the United States, by contrast, is just interested in keeping the Saudis happy and also in selling them weapons. That's a very lucrative business for the United States and also for Great Britain.
There is actually amazing testimony in this piece by the Associated Press. There are named sources who say that tens of thousands of dollars have been paid to al-Qaeda for its members to leave particular areas that are then claimed, as we said in the introduction to this discussion, to then claim that the Americans, the Saudis, the UAE, that their forces have liberated these areas. The question becomes about what happens to Al-Qaeda in the future? Is all of this strengthening Al-Qaeda for it to then be able to continue its terror campaign down the line, years down the line? Sheila.
Well, I think it's quite obvious that they've had a great opportunity to operate, particularly in the south, but in other parts of the country as well. Al-Qaeda specifically, and then there's some other, Salafi-oriented jihadist groups, which again are engaged very directly, most conspicuously in Taiz, which is an important city in the center of the country, where there are street battles. And so, yes, they've been strengthened. And considering Iran to be the principal enemy rather than Al-Qaeda, I think is it's hard to say whether it's naive or actually deliberate. Clearly, there are elements inside of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, not necessarily saying the governments, but there certainly are elements in both countries that provide financial and other kinds of support for Al-Qaeda.
Hussein, we've been talking about Saudi Arabia, the UAE, the United States. What is the Houthi strategy in this war that is now into its fourth year, been going on for more than 3 years?
The Houthi strategy at the beginning, it was to fight Al-Qaeda. We remember that the Houthi has cleared Rada'a area from Al-Qaeda member in a matter of 1 week. And even when they have entered the south, they have cleared most of those area, and the security in Houthi area, is much better than in areas that is in South Yemen, and we hardly see any activity of Al-Qaeda in those area, and their strategy is actually to protect Yemen now, not only from the Saudi-led coalition, but to protect Yemen from Al-Qaeda, because they know that Al-Qaeda will be definitely brought by the Saudi-led coalition, especially by the Emirati, to any area they so-called liberated from the Houthi. And this is what actually happening in the south. And this United Arab Emirates tactic in the south to move Al-Qaeda from city to the rural area is strengthen Al-Qaeda, because it making them not a target for the Saudi-led coalition. And by giving them money, this means they can buy weapons and they can recruit more people. They can use that time for training camp, and as well Al-Qaeda control most of the main road around those cities. So many of the stuff, as example, that comes from outside, the goods, they go through this Al-Qaeda checkpoint, and Al-Qaeda force them to pay taxes. So in this war they getting really strong, and I think if nothing will not be done, if the United Arab Emirates will not stop this support of Al-Qaeda, we will have another something similar to what happened in Afghanistan and in Iraq.
Hussein Al-Bukaiti, Sheila Karapico, thank you both for joining us on the Newsmakers. Earlier this year, the rescue ship the Aquarius pulled more than 100 people from the Mediterranean Sea. Dozens of others drowned during that journey. Some of the rescued who needed medical treatment were taken to a hospital in Tunisia, but the rest of their families made it to Sicily. And for months, those who were separated have failed to be reunited. TRT World's documentary series Off the Grid has the story of family members ending up on opposite shores of the Mediterranean. Christine Pirovilakis reports.
The sea route between Libya and Italy is one of the most dangerous for migrants and refugees.
Quelques minutes, il y a plein de gens qui sont partis à l'eau, qui se sont noyés sous nos yeux.
Many drown, others are rescued. And countless families face separation as an added price of trying to escape to Europe. TRT World's documentary series Off the Grid met some of them on both sides of the Mediterranean. Warren almost lost his life a few months ago when his mother Veronique tried to take him and his brother to Europe without telling their father. Rashida was with them.
Il est sauté, tombé dans l'eau. Ma soeur n'a pas pu supporter la douleur. J'ai dit attends, quand je crie attends. Elle dit non, elle saute aussi, elle suit l'enfant. Elle a réussi à sauver l'enfant, je tiens l'enfant, je ramène. Elle maintenant, je tends la main, elle part dans l'eau. Puis, c'est comme ça qu'elle est entrée dans la mer. Je suis restée, j'ai crié, je pleurais. J'ai crié, elle n'était pas là. Après, elle est ressortie. Je tenais la main. J'avais sa main entre mes mains. Après, la Croix-Rouge est arrivée.
When they reached the ship, the Aquarius, Warren and his mom were both in a coma. They were evacuated by helicopter to a hospital in Tunisia. In the confusion of the rescue operation, Warren's 4-year-old brother Ange stayed behind. Their mother died a few hours later, leaving her 2 sons separated by the Mediterranean Sea.
Vous voyez le destin. Elle est du Cameroun, elle a traversé le Sahara de Libye. Elle est traitée mal avec sa sœur et ses enfants. Elle part dans des bateaux de mort, gonflables. Il se coule à côté de Zarzis. Elle rentre à Sfax parce qu'il n'y a pas des hôpitaux ici. Elle meurt à Sfax après 8 heures de coma. Et maintenant, elle est là.
As soon as he heard that his ex-wife's journey ended badly, Jean-Pierre started to look for his children. He sent pictures, filed reports, and compiled all necessary documents to prove he's their father. Weeks later, his efforts paid off. He found Warren in this refugee center near Zarzis in Tunisia. But his youngest son, Ange, wasn't there. The 4-year-old boy, unaccompanied, had reached the port of Augusta in Sicily, along with hundreds of other survivors. Once there, he was handed over to Italian social services, one of the more than 10,000 minors who have arrived in the country over the past 3 years.
Ange, sì, è lui, Ange. È una bellissima famiglia, sì, guarda, è una famiglia augustana. Abbiamo visto i video del soccorso, io personalmente l'ho assegnato alla famiglia. C'era un gruppo di connazionali che non lo volevano lasciare al momento dello sbarco. Lo tenevano. Abbiamo dovuto veramente fare un'operazione di mediazione dicendo che noi lo accogliamo, ma appena troviamo la famiglia, c'è il papà.
After several months, Ange's brother and father finally managed to see him on Skype. But despite the evidence that Jean-Pierre says he's proved to the authorities, efforts to reunite father and son now appear to be at a standstill. And Warren is still waiting for the return of his brother.
J'ai peur et je ne vais pas lâcher. Je vais tout donner. Je vais tout donner pour récupérer Ange.
Family separations during chaotic rescue operations are hard to avoid. And yes, there will always be relief in knowing your child has been saved. But the challenges in reuniting separated families also add to the suffering of people who have already suffered enough. Christine Pirovolakis, The Newsmakers.
With me here in the studio is the executive producer of the Off the Grid documentary series, Alexandra Polya. And in Geneva, we have Matthew Cochrane. He is the spokesperson for the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Matthew, thank you very much indeed for joining us. If you don't mind, we'll start with Alexandra, because you have met these people. Alexandra, you have made this documentary. It will be aired on Saturday on TRT World. What was the personal experience like for you? What stood out the most for you when making this documentary?
Definitely the level of desperation where we found these people stuck into. We found out about this story, this dramatic rescue that we've been mentioning about, when we were actually in Tunisia in a refugee center, and we came across like mainly women and children who had been rescued, taken like in an emergency situation to Tunisia. I mean, they saved their life, managed to like get them into the center, but then the rest of them, their families, their friends, basically made it on the other side to Sicily. We met them weeks later, and most of them didn't have any news. They didn't know whether their relatives were alive or dead. No one was really telling them what to do and how they could deal with the situation. And really, they were like basically asking us like how to deal with this situation. So we kind of like decided to go on the other side to Italy and try to find out exactly what happened. We were lucky to meet up with like the rescuer, the Aquarius, and they told us like what a dramatic rescue it was, that they literally had like a minute or two to decide like who was going to be put on this helicopter, who was in need of emergency treatment, and they didn't have time to think more about like who was going to travel with them and what was going to happen afterwards. The thing is, I mean, it was a very quick decision, most probably the right one, but it's now taking months, if not years, to fix.
Most of our viewers, most of us, will never meet this kind of person who makes the journey from various parts of Africa to come to North Africa to then make the journey to Europe. Did you get the impression that the people you met knew what to expect on the journey they were making?
No. I had the feeling that these people, and most of the people we met, actually started the journey, I would say, at least like 6 months or 7 months ago. So much before it became, like, you know, like all over the media or whatever. I think a lot of them have been basically cheated, let's put it that way, by smugglers who promised them that, okay, we will take you from Cameroon to Italy. It's going to be an easy one, an easy trip. That's how much it costs. They had no idea, most of them, of what was going to happen to them in Libya. And I think Libya is really like kind of like most probably the most traumatic part of their journey. I haven't met a single woman who hasn't been raped. We haven't met a single man who hasn't been beaten or extorted. So they basically end up completely broken in Libya, and then they're basically put on these dinghy boats. We are not even boats, but kind of like coffins, if you ask me. Those boats can't make it to Italy. Their only hope is just like to basically being rescued either by humanitarian ships or by like international boats, but they can't make it.
Let's pick that point up with Matthew. Matthew, Italy's government has said it's considering a law that would make it a crime for rescue operations to take place and pick up people in the Mediterranean Sea. What does the Red Cross say about that kind of idea?
Where do you begin, I guess, with that kind of idea? I mean, we're talking here about a suggestion that could undermine 100, 150 years of humanitarian norms, that could undermine that basic idea that if someone's in distress, if someone's in danger, they should be helped. It's not a particularly sophisticated idea. You could even suggest that in a way it's setting the bar quite low, but the idea that someone in distress, the idea that a child or a mother drowning shouldn't be helped is undignified and completely unacceptable. You know, the president of the IFRC, of the Red Cross agency I work for, puts it in, I think, in a really compelling way. He talks about firefighters, and he talks about the fact that if a building's on fire and a fire crew turn up, there's no expectation on them that they know anything about the immigration status of who's trapped inside the building, the criminal record of who's trapped inside the building. There's no expectation that they know anything. Their job is to go into the building and save people. And we absolutely refute any suggestion that the role of humanitarians is any different. Our role, the role of NGOs on the Mediterranean, the role of NGOs around the world supporting vulnerable migrants is simply to save lives and to support people who are incredibly vulnerable. The stories that your colleague just described, the experiences of women, the horrific experiences of women through the Sahara, the horrific experiences of men, this is completely unacceptable, and it's completely undignified for us as a civilization, I guess. It's scary to think that these are now discussions that are taking place.
There are tens of thousands of unaccompanied minors all over Europe, Matthew. What can the Red Cross do to help reunifications of these minors with their families? How much assistance do you get? How much positive action do you find governments giving towards you as you try to do something?
It varies from country to country, I would say, and from region to region, from context to context. I mean, when it comes to children, when it comes to the kind of scenario that's described in this documentary, there's very little I understand in place from a legal perspective. I think the legal requirements rely on someone's refugee status or on someone's specific protective status, and that can take a very, very long time. When you're talking about children, kids separated from their mums and dads, I mean, the psychological injuries that these kids can incur in a very short time are can be lifelong, can be absolutely devastating. So we come at it from a very much a humanitarian perspective, which is it's best for everyone, it's best for the families, it's best for the children, most importantly, but it's also best for the countries hosting them that these families are reunited. Again, it doesn't set the bar very high. It's something that the Red Cross does around the world, and the Red Crescent as well, supporting authorities, working alongside authorities to reunite families. This is something that should never be politicised. When a child is separated from their mum or their dad, it's in everyone's best interest that they're brought back together. This is, again, not a remarkable thing to say, I don't think.
Matthew, just finally, we're going to talk about the EU's policy towards migration in just a minute. But what do you make of the politics of fear? Many people seem to have been told by certain sections of the political class that migrants are different and therefore dangerous for whatever reason, whether that danger may come through the impact on the local culture or whether it might be security. Everybody knows that most of these migrants are not white. What do you say about the politics of fear? How can an organization like yours, other international organizations, try to influence people's thinking towards migrants?
Yeah, it's incredibly complicated, and you're right. We're seeing around the world that migration is being used as a wedge issue, and it's winning. Unfortunately, it's winning a lot of people elections, and it's winning a lot of people power. I have a colleague who said to me quite in a fair bit of pain actually that they didn't think that any Western politician would ever lose a vote for speaking ill of migrants, and that's a terrible state for our world to be in. What's the answer? I mean, I don't know, and I think it's not just on us, I think it's also on media outlets like yourself. We can counterbalance that narrative of the other. We can counterbalance that idea that these are somehow just large groups of people who are coming to exploit and to take. Perhaps it lies in finding narratives around commonalities. We're talking about mums and dads, we're talking about teachers, we're talking about doctors, we're talking about lawyers and students, we're talking about people who simply want a better life. And I think there's something to be said in approaching it from that point of view. But I think also there's a debate here, there's two arguments here, there's two issues here that have been conflated, and I think we've all allowed it to be conflated. Whatever we might think individually of migration, governments have a right within their international legal obligations, they have a right to set immigration policy. That's certainly not something that we contest, and we're not here to tell governments that they should allow more or less migration. That's not our role. Our point is that there's no policy goal that justifies increasing the suffering or creating suffering from people. You can control your borders without causing pain and suffering and indignified experiences for vulnerable people. You don't have to do one to achieve the other. And I think within that message, we believe we can find common ground with a lot of people who might, for whatever reasons, feel uneasy about immigration, but feel very strongly about the dignity of the human being. And perhaps if we can focus on building common ground around that, we can turn the narrative away from the really awful and dangerous area it's in at the moment.
Matthew Cochrane, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Newsmakers. Alexandra, thank you very much indeed for coming in. Your program will air first, its first transmission, Saturday, 19:30 GMT on TRT World. Thanks to both of you. Okay, let's broaden the debate now and look at what Europe specifically as a whole is doing about migration, an issue that's often presented as a crisis and a problem. Charlie Yaxley is in Geneva. He's the spokesperson for Asia and Europe at the UN Refugee Agency. From Abbeville in France, we have Patricia Chagnon, a member of the National Rally, the party formerly known as the National Front. Patricia, let me start with you. We ended the last section talking about the politics of fear and how people are concerned about the other being migrants who are coming to Europe. Donald Trump said it just a few weeks ago that it is distorting, I'm paraphrasing him, distorting European culture. And of course, he means white culture. Viktor Orban, the leader of Hungary, says it is devaluing Christian values, these migrants coming to the country. Poland, Hungary, Austria, very much against migrants. Your party in France, very concerned about migration. What are you scared of?
We are not scared of migrants in themselves. We apprehend the sheer numbers, the incessant influx of migrants that keep coming and keep coming. This is actually disrupting our economic balance. It's disrupting our social systems, the burden on, for example, our hospital care, our social welfare. It is also putting a threat to our cultural identity, as we see in dress codes, in different religions working together. Now, this would all not be a problem because France has known influx of many different continents into France who have adapted very well. But it's the sheer numbers today and the people waiting to come. Africa is full of people looking for a better future. And that is all very legitimate. But France, Europe, just doesn't have the room, the possibility to be taking in the whole of Africa. So it is the sheer numbers that are posing a problem. And of course, but I suppose we will talk about that in a minute, the way this whole crisis is being handled by our politicians, by the EU, and by the humanitarian organizations. I will emphasize, though, that we are most sensitive about the human disaster that's taking place, that we are absolutely awfully touched by what's happening in the Mediterranean.
Okay.
But we do see different solutions.
Patricia, you mentioned the numbers. The number of illegal migrants in Italy is 600,000. That's less than 1% of the country's entire population. The figures in France, that's probably what, about 300,000 to 400,000 in the country of 65 million people. Are you seriously concerned about less than 1% of your country's population?
I dispute those numbers. I fully dispute those numbers.
The numbers in Italy are absolutely correct and verified. The numbers in France are less certain.
Numbers in France. France is having at the moment an influx of about the size of the Aquarius boat coming into France every single day. And you just have to walk around France, around the countryside, to see how disruptive it is. Shanty towns are going up in Paris. Shanty towns are up in Calais. No one can get rid of those. Migrants are being dispersed all over villages in France. And it's causing a horrendous disruption to life in France. And crime rates are going up. It is causing major disruption. I dispute the numbers that you're citing for France because it just doesn't match up with the reality that we live every day. And if you'd come to Paris, you'd see it for yourself.
Okay. Charlie, what do you make of the EU's continuing failure to reach a collective deal about how to deal with migration? Many people accept that Italy and Greece in particular, the two main entry points across the Mediterranean, are not receiving the help they need from the rest of the EU. Why can't this bloc make a decision?
Well, I think, first of all, we need to put what's happening on the Mediterranean this year into context. It's no longer a situation that we had in previous years, for example, in 2015, when 1 million people arrived in Europe. The figures are far, far lower. This year, it's around 60,000 people that have crossed the Mediterranean. So these numbers are manageable, and it's a question of political will. But what we need to move away from is countries acting on their own, unilaterally, instead of working collaboratively together to develop a harmonized European approach. And it is those countries like Italy, Greece, and Spain that have been at the forefront of receiving arrivals, but this isn't something any one country can tackle alone. What's needed is for European countries to come together based on the values of which the European Union was founded, on human rights and in solidarity, to come forward and develop a fair and equitable distribution for hosting asylum seekers and refugees in Europe.
Which countries around the world, Charlie, in your experience with the UNHCR, have a workable model to deal with new arrivals, one that integrates them and doesn't threaten whatever the fears are within that host nation? Which countries provide a good example?
Well, there's 90% of the world's refugees are being hosted in developing countries. So actually, when we talk about Europe's ability to receive and integrate refugees, it's really worth putting that into context. I mean, you have countries such as Uganda, which are resource poor, that have received more than 1 million refugees from South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Burundi, and other states. But what they've done is they've continued to allow open borders, but the refugees live side by side with host communities. And they're able to access public services, they're able to work and seek employment. And what this does is it not only more closely integrates refugees with their host communities culturally, but it also allows the refugees to make a positive economic contribution to their local economies. Because more than anything, what refugees want is that they didn't choose to flee their home. They just want somewhere safe where they can rebuild their lives, support their families, and live somewhere in peace.
Patricia, many people think that it's a pull factor, the fact that there are these rescue ships going around the Mediterranean, pulling people out of the sea. But the International Committee for the Red Cross and Red Crescents, it says that that's too simple, that people don't make that calculation for the journey that they are going to make. And also, the other issue is that many people think that this migration issue is not going away anytime soon at all. There'll be many other factors which will push people out of their countries, whether it be war, famine, or climate change, or whatever else it might be. Isn't it time to now start being more constructive rather than destructive in terms of facing this issue?
I understand what you're saying, and I totally agree that the humanitarian crisis is absolutely appalling and cannot go on. I also am happy to hear that you acknowledge that this is not ready to end, that many more will be coming. Now, first of all, I think it's very important that we stop, we need to get rid of the myth that all these migrants are fleeing famine or war. There are a lot of economic migrants between those people. And as I said before, Europe is incapable of giving a future to them all. France has 7 million unemployed people and 10 million living between the poverty line of the people already in our country. We just don't have the means to do any more. What we should be doing, however, is looking how we can stop it. Now, let me get this clear once again. Any boat in distress with people on the Mediterranean, yes, humanitarian organizations, we are grateful that they're looking after them. But they should be bringing them back to the coast in Africa, where we as Europeans, with the international community and with international help organizations, should be constructing villages and places where these people can be safe, fed, educated, have medical care. We would require in those villages that any refugee applications would be made to Europe from the soil in Africa. We would also then close our borders to make absolutely sure that no illegal immigrants can get into Europe by crossing it and using the illegal channels, which are funneling a mafia of traffickers, of human traffickers, which are appalling. You've heard about the prostitution, you've heard about migrants being sold in Spain. This has to stop. Now, the problem I understand very well of the humanitarian organizations that they're caught between two fires. They're caught between one, the absolute need of helping people who are in distress and who are drowning on the Mediterranean, and they have to do that. But we need to, as European community and as an international community, get our heads around the fact that we need to help these people in Africa, like we used to do in the 80s when we had the famine in Sudan and in Eritrea, the war in Sudan and famine in Eritrea. We all remember Aid for Africa, Bob Geldof. I was there at the time. And at the time, refugees, the massive refugees, the millions of refugees in Eritrea and in the south of Sudan were hosted in refugee camps in Sudan. Well, I knew the ones in Sudan and Eritrea at the time where they were being taken care of and prepared to go back to their countries when safe and when possible to do so. What is happening today, and I'll conclude on that, is that we are draining the African continent of young, healthy males that need to be there in rebuilding their country. We are letting a mafia get installed, making money off these poor people, and we have the problem of the amount of people, just of the sheer masses of people. And let me speak for France, coming to France, where we absolutely cannot take care of them. We need to address this issue, and we need to address the issue with ONGs, because we expect that not all of them are actually following the rules. Some of them are actually most probably not following the rules.
Patricia Chagnon and Charlie Yaxley, thank you for joining us on The Newsmakers. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Adnan Nawaz. But do check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Until next time, thanks for watching. Goodbye.